Marlene stared at the monitor as a grainy, high-contrast image flickered into view. Her daughter, Avery, fast asleep in her own bed, unaware that the unblinking eye of her laptop's webcam was streaming her every breath to a stranger. The air in the room turned ice cold when Marlene realized the camera's status light remained dark, a silent betrayal by the very technology she had spent her life mastering. A notification chimed on her own phone, a verbatim transcript of the private conversation she had just finished in the kitchen, sent from an anonymous account. She scrambled to initiate a lockdown, but the cursor moved on its own, dancing across the screen as if guided by an invisible hand. Her keyboard keys began to depress beneath ghost fingers, typing out a single, chilling sentence in the command prompt. "I like the new firewall, Marlene. It makes the game much more interesting." Outside, the motion sensor lights in the driveway surged to life, illuminating an empty yard, while every smart lock in the house clicked open simultaneously, turning her high-tech fortress into a transparent cage. Marlene Pierce froze. Before her eyes, a cascade of crimson code lines erupted across the monitors of her Spokane office, bleeding down the screens like digital wounds. Her fingers struck the mechanical keyboard with rhythmic, percussive force, the clacking of the keys drowning out the low-frequency hum of the surrounding server racks. A single bead of sweat traced a path down her temple, stinging her eye, but she didn't blink. She watched with predatory intensity as one segment of the client's database after another shifted from the red of compromise to the cool, clinical green of security. With a sharp, final thrust of her finger, Marlene hammered the enter key. The chaotic flood of malicious packets ceased instantly, as if she had twisted a physical valve shut. The silence that followed was heavy, almost physical. Marlene stared at the screen, her own pale face reflected in the dark glass of the monitor, framed by the glowing log that confirmed the successful IP block. She exhaled, a long, shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding, and leaned into the mesh back of her ergonomic chair. Her palms vibrated with a fine, uncontrollable tremor, the aftershock of a 10-minute sprint against an invisible aggressor. In the sterile, air-conditioned stillness of SecureNet, the digital storm felt more real than the city of Spokane waiting outside the tinted windows. Marlene pushed through her front door, carrying the scent of a Washington rain and the metallic tang of cooling asphalt into the narrow hallway. The house was quiet, save for a flickering, sickly blue light emanating from the living room. Avery sat on the rug, hunched over, her face washed out by the glare of her laptop. The moment Marlene's foot hit the floorboard, producing a sharp, dry snap, Avery flinched. With a violent thud, the girl slammed the lid of the computer shut. Avery's hands remained pressed hard against the plastic casing, her knuckles white, as if she were trying to physically crush the data hidden inside the machine. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on everything: the coat rack, the shadows in the corner, the baseboards. Except for Marlene's face, the air between mother and daughter thickened, saturated with the weight of things unsaid and secrets kept. Avery scrambled to her feet, clutching the laptop to her chest like a shield, and vanished into the darkness of the hallway. The sound of her bedroom door clicking shut echoed through the empty living room, leaving Marlene standing alone in the damp chill of the entryway. Later that evening, the vibration of Avery's phone on the kitchen table cut through the silence. It didn't ring. It pulsed with a series of short, aggressive notifications that sounded like a mechanical insect. Avery reached for the device, and the sudden bloom of light from the screen revealed pupils dilated with terror. With every new buzz, Avery's shoulders crept higher, tightening until they nearly touched her ears. Suddenly, a choked cry escaped her throat. She threw the phone onto the sofa as if it had burned her and buried her face in her palms. The room filled with her jagged, gasping sobs. a sound that quickly spiraled into a full-blown panic attack. Marlene took a tentative step forward, her arms reaching out to offer some semblance of comfort. But Avery recoiled. She scrambled further into the corner of the room, shaking her head violently. She bit her lip until a thin line of blood appeared, her eyes squeezed shut, refusing to utter a single word. To Marlene, the bitter, sharp scent of her daughter's fear felt almost tangible, a physical barrier she didn't know how to breach. Marlene retreated to her home office, sitting in the shadows as she stared at a social media page. Her cursor hovered over a post that felt like a punch to the gut. There, written in the harsh black and white of a browser window, were Avery's most private thoughts. Her account of a first kiss, her paralyzing fear of being left behind. Marlene recognized the cadence of the sentences instantly. These were the words Avery had scratched into her paper diary, the one with a small, flimsy silver lock. Every word on the screen seemed to sear Marlene's retinas like acid. As she scrolled down, the nightmare deepened. More quotes, more vulnerabilities, all paraded before the public by an anonymous profile. Marlene's heart skipped a beat when she checked the timestamps. The posts weren't just old entries. They were appearing in real time, matching the rhythm of Avery's life as it happened. Marlene walked into Avery's room and sat on the edge of the bed, reaching out to touch her daughter's trembling shoulder. Avery jerked away, bolting upright. Her face was a mask of fury, her eyes shimmering with tears of pure indignation. She pointed a trembling finger toward the doorway, toward the glowing monitors in Marlene's office. Her words came out like rapid-fire rounds, sharp and aimed to hurt. She accused Marlene of bringing this evil into their home, claiming that Marlene's very profession, her obsession with security, had acted as a magnet for this monster. Avery screamed that because of Marlene's paranoia and her work, their private lives had been stripped bare, turned into a sick reality show for some faceless sadist. Marlene remained silent, her fists clenched at her sides, listening to the sound of her daughter shattering their fragile peace with the heavy hammer of blame. The following hour brought a new horror. Marlene gasped as a grainy, high-contrast image materialized on her screen. In the photo, Avery lay asleep, her arms wrapped around a pillow, the edge of her duvet trailing onto the floor. Marlene recognized the specific pattern of the wallpaper. The stuffed owl on the shelf, this was Avery's sanctuary. The angle of the shot pointed directly at the tiny, unblinking eye of the laptop's webcam, which sat on the nightstand. A cold, numbing chill crawled up Marlene's spine. The next frame was worse. Avery was caught in a moment of changing her clothes, completely unaware that an electronic predator was recording every movement. Marlene pressed her palm against her mouth, choking back a wave of nausea. The pixelated image of her child flickered mockingly in the digital void, a trophy displayed for an audience of ghosts. Marlene spent the rest of the night hunched over her keyboard, her eyes bloodshot and burning. The coffee in her mug had long since gone cold, a dark film forming on its surface. At 3 a.m, she finally found it. A strange, looping script buried deep within the school portal's administrative module. She peeled back the layers of code and discovered a gaping hole in the security. A back door left open with deliberate intent. Through this vulnerability, the hacker had harvested everything. Student files, home addresses, contact numbers. Marlene's fingers flew across the keys, the exhaustion replaced by a sharp, metallic spike of adrenaline. She began reconstructing the intruder's path, tracing a digital trail that led straight into the heart of the school's network. Driven by a need to reclaim her home, Marlene moved through the house with the grim efficiency of a soldier. She inserted encrypted tokens into every USB port, replacing standard passwords with 30-character strings of random symbols she committed only to memory. New routers hummed under the ceiling, their blue indicators blinking as she activated a triple-layered firewall. She took a roll of thick, black electrical tape and covered every lens. Laptops, tablets, even the smart fridge. Every movement was deliberate, fueled by a desperate resolve to wall off their lives. She checked the sensors on the windows and doors, turning the suburban house into a digital bunker. Wiping sweat from her forehead, she watched the control monitor as the graphs of blocked traffic began to level out. The illusion of safety lasted only minutes. Avery ran into the kitchen, her face the color of parchment, and thrust her phone toward Marlene with a shaking hand. A message from Anon sat on the screen, sent 60 seconds prior. The text was a verbatim transcript of a complaint Avery had whispered to herself just moments ago while standing at the stove, grumbling about the dinner. Marlene felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. No phones were on. No computers were active. Every device remained tucked away in shielded, signal-blocking pouches. Avery looked around the room, her eyes wide, as if the very walls of the kitchen had ears. The ticking of the wall clock sounded like the heavy strike of a hammer. Marlene realized with a jolt of terror that the witness wasn't outside. The witness was right there, existing in the empty space between the furniture and the shadows. Marlene bypassed the domestic gateways and plugged her diagnostic module directly into the fiber optic trunk line. The map that unfolded on her screen was devastating. A massive, encrypted stream of data was tunneling out of the house to an external server. She watched in horror as she realized that the new security protocols she had just installed were compromised before they even went live. Every command she had typed, every password she had created, had been mirrored and sent to the attacker in real time. She had handed over the keys to the kingdom while the king was watching. A cold sweat broke across her skin. Every action she took was merely a source of entertainment for the person on the other side of the connection. She dove deeper, tearing through the system shell of the smart home controller. Beneath the factory code, she found a process with an unrecognized ID. A parasite consuming enormous amounts of processing power. She isolated the stream and a window popped up. It was a live feed. The monitor showed a distorted, wide-angle view of their kitchen. The audio was crisp, capturing Marlene's own ragged breathing and the soft rustle of Avery's clothes in the next room. Marlene realized the microphones in the smoke detectors and the lenses in the smart thermostats had been weaponized into a surveillance web. She froze, staring directly into the hidden camera, knowing that, at that very second, the enemy was looking back into her terrified eyes. Marlene threw herself back from the desk, gasping for air. The tangle of wires behind the computer looked like a nest of vipers. The school portal hack she had spent hours analyzing now seemed like nothing more than a crude lure, a distraction to keep her busy while the real predator worked. The infection was deep, rooted in the very kernel of her home system, likely planted months ago. The enemy hadn't just been peering through the windows. He had been living with them, cataloging their habits, their weaknesses, and their fears. Every word spoken in confidence was a recorded file. Marlene looked up at the blinking LED of the security system, realizing that in this house, there wasn't a single inch of ground that wasn't compromised. The next morning, the digital assault moved into the physical world. Marlene stood at the supermarket checkout, sliding her card through the terminal. The machine responded with a sharp, rejecting beep and a declined message. She tried a second card, then a third, each one triggering the same crimson light of failure. In her pocket, her phone vibrated with a relentless string of notifications from the secure net server. A red-flagged email titled Urgent Internal Investigation stared back at her. The preview showed screenshots of her private chats, where her professional discussions about clients had been edited into cynical, mocking insults. Marlene felt a suffocating weight press against her chest. The cashier watched her with growing suspicion, her gaze lingering on Marlene's trembling hands as her financial and professional life dissolved into digital dust. Back at the house, Avery opened the front door to check the mail and stopped dead. A small, nondescript cardboard box sat on the welcome mat, devoid of a return address. Marlene heard Avery's muffled gasp and rushed to the hallway. Inside the box, nestled in a bed of gray packing shavings, lay a rag doll. Marlene's heart hammered against her ribs as she noticed the details. The doll wore a tiny, hand-sewn version of a yellow hoodie, complete with a small blue stain on the sleeve, exactly like the blueberry stain Avery had gotten in the park the day before. The doll's face had been carved with deep, jagged grooves, mimicking horrific scars. Avery backed away, her mouth working but no sound coming out, her fingers digging into the door frame until her knuckles turned white. The evening fog was rolling in when a pair of headlights cut through the gloom. Gary's old Jeep pulled into the driveway. He climbed out, his arms full of grocery bags, the ends of a baguette and several juice cartons peeking out. In his other hand, he gripped a heavy black Pelican case bristling with antennas, a professional-grade radio frequency spectrum analyzer. He gave Marlene a short, grim nod, his face set in a mask of determined focus. Marlene caught the scent of pine needles and gasoline as he brushed past her. Gary set the groceries on the kitchen island and squeezed Marlene's shoulder, his voice a low, steady rumble as he promised that no signal would move through these walls without him knowing about it. In the cramped, dusty heat of the basement, Marlene and Gary knelt before the main distribution panel. The air smelled of ozone and old insulation. Gary worked with surgical precision, snipping away the old copper lines and replacing them with high-end shielded fiber optics. Marlene handed him tools, her ears tuned to the calm, grounded rhythm of his voice. Gary turned to Avery, who was perched on the top step of the basement stairs, and offered a soft, reassuring smile. He told her the pros were on the job now. Marlene watched Avery's fists slowly unclench, the girl seemingly hypnotized by the rhythmic clicking of the crimping tool in Gary's hands. For the first time in days, Marlene saw her daughter's chest rise and fall in a steady, normal breath. The peace lasted only until they returned upstairs. Every screen in the living room, the television, Marlene's tablet, Avery's phone, suddenly ignited with a sickening, acid green light. Marlene watched in horror as a montage of edited videos began to play. Her own voice, distorted by a metallic filter, seemed to confess to hating her coworkers and intentionally compromising client data. The images shifted to more intimate violations. Marlene in her underwear in the kitchen, a clip of her shouting at Avery over a broken mug. Gary lunged for the keyboard, his fingers flying, but the system refused to respond. Avery clapped her hands over her ears as a loud, synthesized laugh erupted from the speakers. Marlene stared at the digital wreckage of her life, feeling the reality around her fracture under the weight of the broadcasted lies. The sound of the bathroom door slamming shut followed by the sharp click of the deadbolt. Avery's sobs drifted through the wood, jagged and hysterical. Gary didn't try to force the door. Instead, he sat down on the carpet, his back against the hallway wall. He began to speak in a low, melodic tone, telling Avery stories from the early days of his and Marlene's partnership. Small, funny anecdotes designed to wrap around the girl like a warm blanket. In the office, Marlene hammered at her terminal, her eyes darting across logs as she tried to find the node responsible for the broadcast. She glanced back and saw Gary press his palm against the bathroom door, a gesture of silent solidarity. While she remained lost in a maze of encrypted proxies and ghost servers, Marlene focused on the structure of the malware that was currently holding her system hostage. Her cursor highlighted a specific function used to bypass the sandbox security layer. It was written using highly unconventional libraries, code she had only ever seen in the private, internal repository of a firm they had collaborated with years ago. A knot of dread tightened in her stomach. The coding style was too specific, too idiosyncratic for a random hacker. She scrolled through the lines, finding the characteristic indentations and the way the comments were structured. It was hauntingly familiar, like reading an old, discarded draft of her own work. Gary appeared at her shoulder, holding 2 steaming ceramic mugs. The scent of peppermint and honey cut through the smell of hot electronics. He placed a hand gently over her wrist, stopping the frantic motion of her fingers on the keys. He spoke softly, insisting she take a breath and a sip, pointing out the feverish flush on her cheeks and the way her eyes were beginning to glaze over. He whispered that if she didn't step back for 10 minutes, her brain would simply short-circuit. Marlene took the mug, the heat of the ceramic and the peppermint steam momentarily dulling the sharp, jagged edges of her paranoia. By 3 in the morning, the house was silent, save for the hum of the servers. Marlene finally cracked the virus's kernel. Deep inside, she found a hidden macro designed to optimize the transmission of stolen video data without alerting the network's bandwidth monitors. She froze. This compression algorithm was a mirror image of the one she and Gary had built together during their late-night attempts to launch a startup. She found a specific logical error in the loop, a quirk Gary always referred to as his signature move. The monitors seemed to swim before her eyes. The digital skeleton of their torment was built from the bones of her own shared history with the man sleeping in her guest room. Marlene sat perfectly still in the darkness, the black monitor reflecting her hollowed-out expression. She began to thread the facts together. Every spike in the attack happened exactly 5 minutes after Gary stepped out onto the patio for a cigarette or checked his work tablet. She remembered his sympathetic nods when she cried about the leaks, and how he was always the first to suggest checking the hardware nodes that inevitably turned up clean. A nauseating knot tied itself in her gut. Her fingers gripped the edge of the desk so hard the wood bit into her skin. Gary had always been a step ahead because he was the one drawing the map. She slowly turned her head toward the cracked door of the office. In the living room, a single lamp cast long, distorted shadows across the floor. She could see Gary's profile as he sat in the armchair, slowly sipping from his mug. Avery was curled into a ball on the sofa, finally claimed by an exhausted sleep. Gary was watching the sleeping girl, and Marlene saw a slow, triumphant smile spread across his face, a look entirely devoid of the warmth he had projected all day. He looked like a playwright watching the final act of his masterpiece. He reached down and adjusted the edge of the tablet on his lap, his eyes never leaving Avery's face. The revelation was a physical blow. The digital nightmare that had gutted Avery's self-esteem and ruined Marlene's career had been crafted by the man sitting 5 yards away. Gary was the one who had opened the gates, who had left the doll, who had broadcast their private pain to the world. He had spent years studying Marlene's defenses just so he could be the one to dismantle them and then play the savior. Marlene looked at her own hands, the hands that had welcomed him in and given him the keys to their lives. Gary turned at the faint creak of her chair, and for a split second, she saw the cold, predatory light in his eyes before the mask of the concerned friend slipped back into place. Marlene forced her shoulders to drop, her face settling into a mask of exhausted defeat. She took a long, steadying breath before stepping into the living room. where the air felt thick with Gary's manufactured comfort. He held out a heavy ceramic mug, the steam carrying a sharp, medicinal scent of bergamot. As she took it, her fingers brushed against his hot skin. She didn't flinch, forcing herself to offer a small, grateful nod. The bitter liquid burned her throat as she sank into the armchair, letting her head fall into her hands in a display of simulated despair. Her voice was a fragile whisper as she told him that the last encrypted vault of her savings had been breached. She pointed toward the office, where an imitation of a crypto wallet hack was currently dissolving into a cascade of red pixels on the main monitor. She stood up slowly, swaying as if her strength had finally bottomed out. With a weak gesture, she invited Gary to take the pilot's seat in the office. She rolled her chair back, clearing the way to the 3 monitors that bathed the room in a cold, neon glow. Marlene gripped the back of the chair, her fingers digging into the mesh, and suggested he use his own hardware key to try and intercept the outgoing transaction. Gary stepped forward, and Marlene didn't miss the flare of his nostrils, the unmistakable sign of a man about to claim his prize. She retreated into the shadows of the corner, watching as Gary reached into his pocket and produced a titanium-cased flash drive. Gary leaned over the desk, the rhythmic, mechanical clacking of the keys filling the room. His fingers moved with a frantic, joyful energy as he rescued Marlene's assets. He was too deep in his own arrogance to notice the tiny, infrared pulse of a hardware keylogger she had taped to the underside of the desk 10 minutes earlier. Marlene stood behind him, her eyes fixed on his reflection in the glass of the bookshelf. Every keystroke, every unique administrative password, and every hidden backdoor algorithm he used was being mirrored to a cloud server she had spun up on a burner account. Gary licked his lips, completely consumed by the act of digital plunder. Marlene gave a sharp, imperceptible nod to the doorway where Avery stood, a ghost in the shadows. Avery's hand moved to the wall-mounted touch panel, her fingers dancing over a pre-programmed sequence. A low, subterranean hum vibrated through the floorboards as the living room's massive media center roared to life, its screen igniting with a blinding, white light. Marlene felt the air grow heavy as the house switched to its independent battery backup, a move that physically severed the external connection Gary would need to shut the system down. Avery stepped back, the remote clutched in her hand like a weapon, as the roar of the server fans reached a fever pitch. The atmosphere in the room was electric, a storm about to break, while Gary remained hunched over the keyboard, still oblivious to the trap snapping shut. The wall of the living room suddenly transformed into a giant mirror of Gary's own monitor. Marlene watched as the truth was laid bare for Avery to see. On the massive screen, 2 windows were tiled side by side, one showing the anonymous attacker's command console, the other showing Gary's current terminal in real time. The code was identical. His unique shorthand, his specific comments, and his stolen files were all there, synced in a perfect, damning harmony. Avery stared at the screen as folders filled with their private photos appeared, each one tagged with Gary's digital signature. The blue light of the display caught Gary's profile, freezing him in place as he finally realized he was looking at his own soul stripped bare on the wall. Marlene stepped out of the corner, her voice cutting through the hum of the machines like a blade. She spoke with a terrifying, rhythmic clarity, informing Gary that the room had been turned into a digital kill box. She pointed to the blinking upload indicator, explaining that every second of his activity, along with a full packet capture of his confession, was being streamed directly to the Spokane Police Department's cybercrimes unit. A single, heavy drop of sweat fell from Gary's chin onto the keyboard. He spun around, his face contorted, but Marlene met his gaze with a look of absolute, frozen calm. She added that the security team at SecureNet had already been alerted to his use of their proprietary libraries. Gary let out a guttural, animalistic snarl and surged out of the chair, sending it crashing into the bookshelf. He lunged for the wall, his hands clawing at the cables, trying to rip the power from the source to kill the broadcast. Marlene was faster. She stepped into his path, her palms slamming into his chest with surprising force. The fabric of his shirt was hot and damp with sweat. He tried to shove her aside, but she held her ground, using her entire weight to anchor herself as a human shield in front of the server rack. Gary's face was inches from hers, his breath foul and ragged as his mind raced to find a way to destroy the physical evidence of his betrayal. The tendons in Gary's neck stood out like cords as he began to scream. He sprayed spittle as he shrieked at Marlene, calling her pathetic and weak for ever trusting him. He roared that she had practically invited him into her bed and her network, and that she deserved every bite of the humiliation he had served her. He framed his terror as a lesson in high-level security, a necessary wake-up call that she was too stupid to learn on her own. Marlene stood there, absorbing the toxic flood of his rage without flinching, watching as the man she had called her best friend devolved into a cornered, snarling beast. Avery stepped into the light, her smartphone held out in front of her. She didn't tremble. She held the device with a steady, surgical grip, the lens pointed directly at Gary's heaving chest. Marlene saw her daughter's thumb resting firmly on the record button, capturing every curse and every self-incriminating boast that spilled from Gary's mouth. Gary froze, the words dying in his throat, as he looked into Avery's eyes and found no fear, only a cold, clinical observation. The room fell into a heavy, vacuum-like silence, broken only by the cooling fans of the computers. Gary's arms slumped to his sides, the realization sinking in that his rage was now just another entry in a digital dossier. The silence was shattered by the sudden, discordant wail of sirens. Red and blue strobes began to pulse against the living room curtains, rhythmic and relentless. A heavy, metallic thud echoed from the front door, followed by the sound of splintering wood as figures in tactical gear flooded the entryway. Gary didn't even have time to turn before two officers tackled him, slamming him face first into the carpet. Marlene heard the sharp, double click of handcuffs ratcheting shut over his wrists. Gary let out a muffled groan against the floor as they read him his rights. Marlene stood beside Avery, feeling the last of the adrenaline-fueled tremors leave her body, while a police boot stepped on Gary's titanium flash drive, crushing the casing into a heap of useless plastic. A month later, Marlene stood in the center of a hollowed-out living room. The furniture was gone, leaving only pale, rectangular ghosts on the hardwood floor. The air was clean, smelling of citrus soap and the absence of electronic ozone. Through the front window, she watched two movers slide the heavy door of a van shut, sealing away the last of their boxes. Avery was waiting on the porch, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her posture straight and her head held high. Marlene ran a hand over the empty wall where the monitors used to hang and felt nothing but a profound sense of relief. Spokane was waking up behind them, but it was a city they no longer belonged to, its streets filled with the echoes of a nightmare they had finally outrun. Marlene reached into her pocket and pulled out her corporate access card, the plastic edges sharp against her thumb. Without a second thought, she flicked it into the trash bin at the curb. She walked over to Avery and pulled her into a fierce, silent embrace, breathing in the scent of her daughter's hair, pure and free of the smell of hot circuits. She whispered to Avery that their lives belonged to them now, not to the algorithms or the lenses. She could already see the work ahead of her, the stacks of legal filings for the foundation she was building to protect others from people like Gary. Marlene took Avery's hand, feeling the solid, warm reality of her daughter's palm. And they walked down the steps to the car together, leaving the house and the digital ghosts behind. The end. Do not proceed past this point.